My first encounter with Dr. Gilligan's work emerged after a visit to a bookstore in Vermont, where I found a well-read paperback copy of Violence: Reflections on a National Epidemic. As I began reading, I was struck immediately by the author's perspective on violence as a tragedy that involves not just victims, but also victimizers. A tragedy from which few family histories are left entirely untouched, and a tragedy in large part because prevention is possible. For Dr. Gilligan, our limited success in preventing violence stems less from a lack of know-how and more from a lack of will. Dr. Gilligan brings to his writings deep insight into the darkness of humanity, a compassion for all those who've suffered, and a passion and commitment for change. He's become a leading voice in calling for a shift from punishment to prevention, a consultant on violent crime and punishment, including war crimes, to many world leaders and organizations. He's the author of several books, including Violence: Reflections on a National Epidemic, Preventing Violence: Prospects for Tomorrow, and Why Some Politicians Are More Dangerous Than Others. He will talk today on how education can influence the causation and prevention of violence. It is indeed a great pleasure and honor to present Dr. James Gilligan.
Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. And first, I'm going to say it is an honor to be here. This is a well-attended conference, and I know from my interactions with in the workshop that I was involved with this morning, some amazing people are here. I mean, I am really impressed at the number of people who are deeply interested in such a difficult and painful topic, which most people, frankly, just avoid as far as they possibly can. I mean, who wants to think about such a grim subject? Unless it's presented as entertainment, and as I said in the workshop this morning, violence is a very popular topic as long as it's cast as entertainment. I mean, you know, everybody loves murder mysteries and cops and robber movies and so forth. But once you start talking about it as something real and serious that actually involves real people and real pain and loss, people's eyes blur over and they leave the room and so forth most of the time. But this obviously is a population of people that have the courage and the ego strength to tolerate the unpleasantness of this subject. I mentioned at the workshop that sometimes people have told me they read one of my books on their vacation at the beach. And I would say, my God, I hope it didn't ruin your vacation. Because it's a grim, difficult subject. As was mentioned, I learned whatever I do know or think I know about violence, well, from several sources. One was actually from growing up with a violent father who used to beat up my brothers, although he was never prosecuted or sent to jail. He was always regarded as a model of, you know, really a paragon of respectability. But privately in the home, you know, he was very violent, extremely. But I had no interest in violence. When I first started my training, I wanted to be a psychoanalyst and treat people more or less like myself. But I, neurotic, that is. But I sort of somewhat accidentally, that is to say unconsciously, got involved in a program in my training that I had never heard of before and had no interest in, called prison psychiatry. And I got hooked. I decided this was the most important social problem I could possibly devote my life work to. It was also the most moving experience I'd had in psychiatry, because even more than with some of the patients I'd been treating in the teaching hospital I was training in, the connection between life experience and adult outcome just seemed much clearer and really extremely emotionally moving. I'm not saying this isn't true with people with major mental illness, but when I got into the prisons and I heard about the degree of child abuse that the most violent of the men I worked with had experienced, which was off the scale of anything I had even thought of applying the term child abuse to. I realized I was face to face with the deepest human tragedies on a daily basis. Not only the tragedies of what these violent men had done to their victims, but also what had been done to them before. And I began to realize that, a lot of my moral categories had to be kind of rethought about good and evil and responsibility. And I began to think, if I had had the experience some of these guys had had, I can't guarantee that I would not have turned out much the way they did. I'm talking about the fact that the most violent of the people I saw they were themselves the survivors of their own attempted murder, often at the hands of their parents, or the survivors of families in which one of their closest relatives had in fact been murdered. I also just found it the most intellectually challenging and fascinating subject I'd ever come across. I mean, each time a new criminal would come into the prison and come into my office, I would ask myself, what in God's name could have induced one human being, like this guy sitting in front of me, to treat other human beings the way he did? I mean, the crimes they'd committed were sometimes truly just appalling, as you can imagine. That's why they were sent to prison. And no sooner had I finally begun to figure out an answer, to understand why this person did what he did, then another person would come in, and I'd have to start that process all over again. It was just as much of a mystery. So that has kept me intellectually challenged to this day. I said I spent 25 years trying to break out of prison because it was so fascinating. I just couldn't leave, even though it is grim. There's no question. I mean, it's draining emotionally, to say the least. But it was fascinating, so that when my friends and classmates who went on to a more conventional career in mainstream psychiatry or psychoanalysis would ask me, why are you working in such a horrible place? And I would answer, I would say that, didn't they ever hear what the famous American bank robber said when he was asked why he robbed banks? And he said, well, that's because that's where the money is. And I said, I've gone into the prisons because that's where the violence is. And I'm interested in violence. And I thought, if you want to learn something about violence, it might be a good idea to start with violent people and try to learn from them. So the violent people, the violent men, by the way, I worked almost exclusively with men, which I regret, but that's just an accident of who we had the contracts with. But that they were, what was I going to say about that? Sorry, I was up most of the night trying to get here, so a little bit fading out from time to time. But another remark that friends of mine, when they'd asked why I was working in this terrible environment, I was reminded of a famous dialogue between Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson in the 19th century, when Thoreau, because he opposed the Mexican War, in which the United States was the aggressor, and refused to pay his taxes because he said that was going to support this war that he morally disapproved of. So they put him in the jail in Concord, Massachusetts, and Ralph Waldo Emerson came to visit him and said, Henry, why are you in jail? And Thoreau looked at him and said, Waldo, why aren't you in jail? And that was, again, how I felt. Why weren't my classmates and the people that I studied with spending their time studying violence as a psychiatric problem, or as a problem in a larger sense, I'd say, in public health and preventive medicine, including preventive psychiatry, and preventive psychology and social work and so on. Now, I know that you've had, a terribly tragic and traumatic experience with violence at Dawson College and other institutions near here. just as we have in the United States. And I just want to mention that I'm coming here I come here from the United States, but not as somebody who can tell you, what a great job we're doing there, which maybe you can learn from. Because in fact, Canada's done a much better job than the U.S. has at preventing violence. Our murder rates are from 5 to 7 times as high as Canada's murder rates are. So I come here as somebody who is eager to learn from you. I think we have more to learn from Canada than I have to teach Canadians. But I will try to share with you what I've learned, a lot of which I would say consists of, frankly, just simply of learning how what I thought I knew was so wrong, and how I had to keep relearning. Before I started working with prisoners, when I took this elective rotation in prison psychiatry during my training, I had been taught up to that point that violent criminals, the people who got sent to prison, were untreatable. You should just forget about them. They were incurable. They wouldn't tell you the truth because they were psychopathic liars almost by definition. And how can you do psychotherapy with somebody who's telling you lies? You have to have somebody who's truthful. They have no motivation to introspect and understand what they did wrong. They just want to manipulate you into persuading the parole board to let them out sooner, and blah, blah, on and on and on and on. So I thought that was true, and I understood this population. I wasn't going to be taken in by them, and I thought it was going to be an exercise in futility, and it would be rather boring. And then, as I said, I was astonished to learn that most of what I thought I knew was false, or at least was at best a half-truth that left out the more important half. And I had to kind of recalibrate, and I've tried to be able to keep doing that the longer I study this subject. What I thought I would try to talk about here today is not so much to be super specific about what any specific school or college or university should do or can do to prevent violence in our society, because, I mean, there are so many different contexts and situations that I can't possibly cover all the variations that might be relevant. But what I would like to do is try to present to you a number of general conclusions and general principles that I've evolved over the years of working with this population of violent men. And my sense is the more that you sort of see these general patterns, the more you recognize them, the more you'll be able to adapt them in your own institutions. I don't mean to say, by the way, that I may not be saying a lot of things that many of you do already know. For some of you, I may just be, reaffirming things that you've already learned from your own experience. But I want to begin with one of the experiences that led me to think that what I thought I knew was wrong, or just something that I hadn't been taught at all. I learned something from prisoners that I had never read about and had never been taught. And that was that when I would ask them, one after another, why he had assaulted or even killed one person or another, either in the prison or before he got to prison, I would get the same answer in almost identical language: because he disrespected me, or he disrespected my visitor, or my mother, or my girlfriend, or my buddy, or whoever. But they use that term disrespect so often, they abbreviated it into the slang term that I'm sure you've heard on television and the movies. He dissed me. And I realized that anytime people use a word so often they abbreviate it, it tells you something how central it is in their psychological vocabulary. When I first began to realize this, and I began to think that maybe what we're talking about here is people feel that somebody is, when they're disrespecting them, are shaming them or insulting them or putting them down, that, you know, maybe this is why they became so violent. As I said, these men had become my teachers and I was their student. I was asking them to teach me why they had become so violent, and I felt they were complying. They were doing that. And what I found was that I thought I had discovered something new, and then I reread a passage in the Bible that I had probably read 40 times before in my life, but had never understood. I'd never understood why the first recorded murder in Western history took place. That's the story of Cain and Abel. To me, it made no sense. Why in the world did Cain kill Abel? There was no cause that I could see, no motive. And then, after I'd actually worked with murderers who had told me, I could finally hear what the Bible said. In the King James Version, it says, God had respect unto Abel and unto his offering, but unto Cain and his offering, God had not respect. And it struck me that God had dissed Cain, or Cain had been dissed because of Abel, and he had responded in the same way as my murderers in the prison had when they got dissed. I talked with armed robbers who, you know, I had assumed they committed their armed robberies to get money. I mean, that's what they'd like you to think, just like the bank robbers, Willie Sutton. You know, the banks are where the money is. But actually, when you sit down and talk with people who've spent a good part of their life doing that, and some of these guys had committed maybe 200 armed robberies before they finally got caught and put in prison, they would quickly start saying, I never got so much respect before in my life as I did when I had a gun pointed at some dude's face. And it struck me that for people who have spent a lifetime living on a diet of disdain and contempt from other people, or being treated as inferior or unimportant, it was worth more to them than their liberty or even their life to get this kind of instant respect at the end of a gun. And they, in many cases, the most violent of the inmates, I mean, this is the extreme end of the intractably violent, had the same scenario. Again, it's something I had not read before, I hadn't learned about, and they surprised me by saying their fantasy in life was to go to their own death in a blaze of glory, a hail of gunfire, but as long as they could kill as many other people first, before the police shot them to death, they would feel fulfilled. I thought, good God. But these weren't just words. These guys actually behaved that way. They would behave that way in the prison. They would virtually dare the correction officers to kill them in order to stop them from some violent behavior. And I learned that many people in America, in the United States at least, do that in actuality on the street outside of prison. That is, every year the U.S., the National Center for Health Statistics, our vital statistics branch of the Public Health Service, tots up how many people died and from what cause. And they always list several hundred people who die from what they call legal intervention. Well, you know what that means? It means that the police shot them to death on the street, you know, as a way of stopping them from killing other people or killing more people. So several hundred people go to their death acting out this scenario that my violent prisoners were telling me about in the prison. It said something to me about how when people are humiliated deeply enough by their life experiences, there's a kind of dissociation, I think, between the body and the soul, the body and the mind. When most of us talk about an instinct of self-preservation, what we take for granted, I think, is that self-preservation includes the survival of the body. But I found that was not true for these men. they were willing to sacrifice their bodies, that is their physical survival, and become physically dead, if that was the only way that they felt they could save their souls. That is their sense of personal identity. The only way they could recover from the humiliation they'd suffered. Because what many of these men would tell me, again, I'm talking about the most violent end of the continuum, was that they themselves had died, usually before they'd even started killing other people. And what they meant by that was that at a point in their life, some of them could even describe when this had happened. They just stopped having feelings. They felt numb inside. They felt dead inside, empty. They would describe themselves that, that they felt like they had straw or hay inside of them instead of flesh, or cords and ropes rather than nerves and veins. And the only time they really could demonstrate to themselves and prove to themselves that they were really alive was when they cut themselves and could see the blood flowing. They would use words to describe themselves that refer to the living dead, like zombie or vampire or robot. And invariably, what had provoked this sense of inner deadness was an experience of having been overwhelmingly humiliated by parents who put them down, or by people in the after their childhood in the community. And I realized that for them, the survival of the body was much less important than trying to undo this wound to the soul. Some of them didn't feel they had died yet, but they felt vulnerable to that they would die unless they could put up a tough facade and prove to the world that, don't mess with me. But what they were describing, what they were, I think, revealing, was their own sense of vulnerability, that they just wouldn't survive this. They would describe having lost the capacity for any feelings, meaning either emotions or physical sensations. So they would cut themselves or mutilate themselves in other ways, put foreign objects in every orifice in their body, till they were really destroying their own vital organs. And they would do that not as self-punishment. These were not people who felt guilty for the crimes they'd committed. They were trying to see if they could have feelings, because they found this state of numbness and deadness more intolerable than even pain would be, physical pain or emotional. They had lost the capacity for emotional feelings like love or fear or sadness. They just felt dead. When I later, in more recent years, started reading in the newspapers, as you all have, as we all have, about suicide bombers, terrorists, who have the goal of going to their own death in a blaze of glory, killing as many people as possible, even at the expense of their own life, I thought, I've seen this before. This is exactly what the prisoners were describing to me in the prisons. I mean, this is, I think, a universal pattern when people feel so humiliated and so desperate that they can't tolerate it any longer, and they're willing to sacrifice their own physical existence if that's the only way to save their souls as they see it. I mention all this because I think it's vitally important that we understand it if we want to do a better job of being able to prevent the violence, which can occur at any level for any of us, whether it's in our own schools and our own communities, or whether it occurs in the Middle East, or in the World Trade Center towers, or wherever it occurs. I think there are some universal patterns here. And the way I'd say it is that I think that the experience of being shamed and humiliated, of feeling disrespected and insulted, or rejected, or suffering what psychoanalysts call a narcissistic wound or injury, is a universally necessary but not sufficient cause of violent behavior. I'd say it's necessary because I've never talked with a violent person where that didn't come out, where it wasn't clear that the provocation for the violence was some feeling of having been humiliated, not necessarily by the particular victim they chose, but by somebody whom they were getting revenge on by killing somebody. But I think it's universal. For example, we're here to, I think, talk mostly about, say, school violence, what schools can do to decrease the amount of violence in our society. But I think even in other contexts, the same things occur. In the first public statement that he made after the events of 9/11, Osama bin Laden, in a videotaped speech that came out within a month of the 9/11 disaster, said that these events were the way of forcing the West, that is Western culture and civilization, as represented by the U.S. and the World Trade Center towers, to taste what he said the entire Islamic nation had been tasting for the past 80 years of humiliation and contempt. In other words, that it was the sense of humiliation that motivated the attacks on the World Trade Center tower. And that message is recurrent throughout the entire literature on contemporary terrorism. That's what one investigator after another has found on the basis of interviewing people who were terrorists. Now, I say that shame is necessary but not sufficient to cause violence because, after all, we've all been shamed. I mean, it's a universal human experience. That you've been embarrassed, or somebody's insulted you, or humiliated you, or we've done something stupid ourselves that we feel ashamed of, or there's some flaw in our character that, or some weakness or ignorance that we're ashamed of. Everybody experiences shame, but most people never commit an act of serious violence in their whole lives. It struck me that there have to be several preconditions present before shaming will cause violence. One of them, I would say, that's very important, is the absence of nonviolent means of maintaining or restoring one's self-esteem and self-respect, even after one has been shamed or humiliated. For example, when any of us, or anybody in this room, has some experience of being shamed or embarrassed, we have other resources available, both inner resources and external social ones, by which to maintain or restore our self-esteem. The people I saw for example, we have some degree of education or a career or a good job or some esteem that we're held in by friends and family or colleagues and on. But people have something. The people in the prisons were, I say 99%, almost completely lacking in these things. The violent prisoners I worked with, many were illiterate, uneducated, unemployed, often homeless, rejected by their families often, basically at the bottom of the social status hierarchy, and often members of minority groups that are systematically shamed and humiliated by the majority white culture, and certainly in the United States, as I've seen it. So I thought it was understandable that when people don't have the nonviolent resources that the rest of us do, they are much more vulnerable to violence. Another thing that was clear to me was that when people have been shamed from the beginning of their lives, it makes it almost impossible to develop the capacity for guilt feelings. And this is a paradox. Shame and guilt, I have to say, are often used kind of as more or less synonymous terms. I want to suggest that they're really opposites. That when people feel shamed, shame is the opposite of pride or self-love. And shame is a blow to one's pride. It's a diminution of one's pride. The guilt, however, is most intense the more intense one's pride is, which is a psychological fact that is caught in the Catholic theology, where pride is considered the deadliest of the 7 deadly sins. That is, it is the most guilty state of mind, the most sinful. It brings guilt with it. The people I saw in the prisons were amazingly lacking in the capacity for guilt feelings. I couldn't believe it. The more extreme the violence they committed, the more heinous the crime they had committed, the more completely they were lacking in feelings of guilt or remorse or empathy for their victim, and so on. And it struck me that, but of course, when you think about it, it makes sense. Because if they had the capacity for guilt feelings, they couldn't have committed the kind of crime that they had. I mean, most of us, if we're insulted, we may be angry at the person who insulted us, but we would also feel guilty if we started saying, well, you know, I'm going to kill him and also his whole family or his whole tribe or whatever. So the absence of guilt feelings is another precondition, I'd say, for shame, stimulating violence. To get back to the issue of the preconditions for shame causing violence, I mentioned that the absence of nonviolent resources is important. Here I want to quote something that Malcolm X said, the great African-American leader, who was surprisingly, to me, insightful psychologist, because I don't know, where he got this, but he made some amazingly insightful remarks, such as that he said that nobody can give somebody else self-respect. People can only gain that for themselves. And but he said, I mean, they can only get it through their own achievements, or they're becoming the kind of person they can respect, and so on. But he said that the rest of us can influence whether they're able to do that. And one way we can is by determining whether or not the individual has access to the resources that people need in order to gain self-respect, including, for example, education, which, as I mentioned, is one thing that I think helps to cushion most of us against even severe humiliations. At least we have the self-respect that comes from knowing we have some skills or knowledge that we respect in ourselves and that elicit respect from others. But when I decided to do a study in the Massachusetts prisons to learn what program had been most effective in preventing further violence after prisoners left the prison, and I'm talking about people who had committed murders or rapes, but who finally had wrapped up their sentence and left, sometimes after 12 or 15 years. We found one program and one only that had been that successful in preventing reoffending after leaving prison, and that was prisoners getting a college degree while in prison. Over a 25-year period, several hundred prisoners had gotten a college degree before they left the prison. Not one of them was returned to prison. They were taught in prison by Boston University professors who donated their time to do this, so it wasn't costing the state a penny. When I described these results in a public lecture, a friend of mine gave my lecture to our new governor in Massachusetts, who was a former prosecutor who had been elected to office on the campaign promise to reintroduce prisoners to the joys of busting rocks. I mean, he was a Neanderthal, criminologically, but he knew that the voters would love that kind of rhetoric, and they did. They elected him. So he went on television, gave a press conference and said, we've got to get rid of this program of having free college education in the prisons. He had not even known there was such a program before. He said, because otherwise people who are too poor to go to college are going to start committing crimes so they can get sent to prison to get a free college education. And he literally said this and shut down the program. Now, he was smart enough to know this was nonsense, but he also was smart enough to know that it would win him votes. I mean, that it would appeal to a certain segment of the electorate that feels there's nothing too, there's no punishment too severe, and that there's no reason to give anything positive to criminals, even if that will reduce the rate of violence in our society. And lest you think that was the behavior just of one governor in the United States, the entire U.S. Congress, after Newt Gingrich brought a very conservative majority into the House of Representatives in the U.S., repealed the federal monies that had been making free college education available to prisoners throughout the country. So in the name of being tough on crime, we systematically eliminated the most effective single program we've yet discovered for reducing the amount of crime and violence in our society. So no wonder we have a homicide rate that's 5 to 7 times high as yours is, or any other Western democracy. Now, let me immediately make a couple of qualifications. Of course, the prisoners who got a college degree while in prison were a select group. I know that. They were, I told you, a majority of the prisoners are either illiterate or barely literate. So clearly this was a more well-educated and more, motivated group. But on the other hand, it did strike me that the problem of violence is so severe in the U.S., and the degree of recidivism is so high in our state prisons. 2/3 of the prisoners are returned to prison within 3 years. And I'm talking about 0 readmissions in 25 years. We found when we extended the program to 30 years, 2 people had come back. That's less than 1% recidivism over 30 years. So you would think that any political leader would want to maximize this program. But as I said, instead, they eliminated it. Now, I can also understand the feelings that people might have in sympathy with the governor. When I have described what I just did, often at community colleges in the U.S., where students really do have to make painful sacrifices in order to pay for their own college, they are very sympathetic to what the governor said, that they don't want prisoners being given a free college education when they're not. But to me, there's a very simple answer to that quandary. I can totally empathize with the students. I see their point. But what I cannot understand is why a nation as wealthy as the United States, as wealthy as it has been, for most of the 20th century, why we haven't done what most European countries have done, and that is make college education free and available to anybody and everybody who wants it, regardless of their ability to pay, just as we make primary education and secondary education universally available. I mean, why do we stop with high school and 12 years? Why not make college available? I have a good friend in France, somebody who my youngest son lived with his family in France for an academic year, who is a distinguished and very productive expert in infectious diseases. But he was born to a poor family in France, and because he was a good student, the government paid his tuition. He first became a veterinarian, and then he decided he liked, biology and curing disease enough that he thought, why don't I become a medical doctor? So then he went to medical school, and that was also paid for by the government. Now, he didn't pay a penny to do this. Of course he did the work, And he is now somebody who contributes a great deal to the medical profession and to the health of the French public. There's no reason why this kind of, what I would call a divide and conquer strategy has to exist. There is a reason why it does exist. I think that conservative politicians in the U.S. do realize that they can get the public to ignore the inequities in our society with a divide and conquer strategy. If they don't provide a free college education for everybody, then of course they're going to get people to say, we don't want prisoners to be getting a free college education, because they aren't. That, along with many other factors, can distract them from noticing that, in fact, the outcome of all this is a much more violent society than we need to have, or than we would have if we simply spread the wealth more equitably in our very wealthy society. But if you're leading a political party whose fortunes depend on meeting the needs of the very wealthiest segment of the population, you're not going to worry about these things that much. You're going to try to take care of the wealthy, and to hell with the question of how much violence you wind up with. Now, the relation of all this to schools is twofold. On the one hand, as I've said, education is, I think, one of the most powerful tools or institutions, you might say institutional practices in our society for reducing the level of violence that we have. And at the same time, we all know that sometimes in educational institutions, students are in fact subjected to overwhelming degrees of humiliation, to the degree that they will kill either themselves or other people, or both. I don't know if you read about this here, but maybe 6 or 8 months ago, something like that, a college student in New Jersey at Rutgers University, a freshman, incoming freshman, a male, was secretly videotaped by his roommate and the roommate's girlfriend having sex with another guy. And they put this videotape on the internet. I mean, I don't know, Facebook, or I don't know, whatever it was. So it was available to everybody. And it so humiliated this young man that he promptly went out and jumped off the George Washington Bridge over the Hudson River in New York City, committing suicide. So what I'm saying is, sometimes the things that go on in schools or universities are so humiliating that they are really life-threatening. I mean, they really do result in deaths. And let me just read a little bit from some of what I've written, summarizing work I did on the school shootings in the United States. After one of, you remember maybe in the 1990s, there were 6 or 8 massacres in American high schools. After one of these, the attorney for the boy who'd done this contacted me because he said, this kid walks right out of the pages of your book. He'd read my book about violence and the causes of it. And he got me involved in the case. I read all of the psychiatric and psychological reports. I had interviews with the boy and so forth. Now, let me just describe some of what I learned from that. This boy killed and wounded several of his classmates in the late 1990s, following which he cried out, "Kill me now." I mean, exactly like the prisoners that I described, or the suicide bombers. When he was interviewed by a detective, he was at first unable to explain why he had done this, and then blurted out, "I guess I just got mad because everybody kept making fun of me," or, in other words, ridiculing him. Later interviews with psychiatrists and psychologists revealed the extent both of his anger and of the teasing that contributed to it. His early memories of school centered on themes of being taunted. He said that kids continued to pick on him when he began high school. He described extensive harassment in which he was called gay, faggot, nerd, geek, and pussy. So it's being said that he's not really a man or even male. Gay and faggot is in this adolescent homophobic world incompatible with being masculine, and pussy is the slang term for a female. He stated that he was also spat upon. I mean, other kids literally spit at him. The harassment became particularly pernicious following publication of a false rumor in the school newspaper that he was having a homosexual relationship with another student. He was humiliated by the allegation, particularly when other students began to tease him and call him gay and faggot almost daily. He felt that his peers began to assault his masculinity because, in his view, he wasn't mean enough. And of course, the image of masculinity in our patriarchal society often is you have to prove you're a real man by being violent or mean. He's not had any sexual experiences and said kids made fun of him because of that. His anger over rejections and humiliations mounted. He then hit upon the solution that an act of violence would change the way kids perceived him in school and give him the recognition and acceptance he longed for. He found the idea of shooting students and taking over the school compelling. He imagined that he would gain the respect and awe, if not admiration, of other students. No one would tease him or humiliate him again. I mean, if you want to stop that, kill enough people and they'll stop teasing and humiliating you. He repeatedly said that at the time of the shooting, the thought which kept running through his mind was, "You've got to do this for yourself." And I want to emphasize, he means literally his self, because the state of deadness that I described, when prisoners would tell me they had died, they mean their self had died. They think of the self as a fragile, vulnerable psychological construct that we human beings develop and create through the process of growing up from infancy, into adulthood. So it is his self he's trying to save, even at the expense of his body. There's probably no better indication of the subjective distress he experienced before the shooting than the statement he made that prison would be better than what he was going through, because at least the teasing would stop. He thought that if he got into trouble, he wouldn't lose that much because, quote, "I didn't have that much. I didn't feel as if anyone really liked me." He reported that he was tired of people making fun of me. I couldn't stand it anymore. If I shot one of them or scared them all, they would leave me alone. When he actually brought his guns to school, a friend of his was so impressed, he said, "You got the biggest balls here." Well, suddenly he's a Superman, not just a man, but the biggest balls. He felt he couldn't change his mind about using the guns once he'd brought them to school because, quote, "the boys would laugh at him for bringing the guns if he didn't go ahead with the plans to use them." Ironically, his plan for gaining respect through violence turned out to be more successful than any other strategy had up to that point, for he said that after the incident, "People respect me now." He reported that he liked the juvenile detention home, which he was put in immediately after the shooting. He liked it better than high school, that the kids were nicer to him. He was not being teased or put down. When he was surrounded with other violent kids, they respected his violence. The tragedy, of course, is that neither he nor the adults responsible for him found any less destructive way to enable him to diminish or tolerate the overwhelming shame and humiliation he'd been experiencing. Now, I've I could describe the Columbine shootings. They're a repetition. I mean, every single one of the school shootings, and I analyzed all of the ones that occurred at that time, every one of them had an essentially identical scenario. And as you remember, the Columbine shooters, both of those boys actually did kill themselves at the end of the shootings. That's why I think if we really want to reduce the amount of violence in our society, we really have to understand that these kids or the grown-ups who do similar things, like Osama bin Laden's followers, really are so desperate and so determined to undo the humiliations they feel they've experienced that they are freely willing to go to their own deaths in order to do that, so that the idea that somehow we can deter them with more violence of our own is just about as insane as they are. I mean, we are really no more in touch with reality than they are. If you want to deter somebody who's ready to kill himself, you're not going to do it by threatening him with death. If anything, that's only a further enticement to do it. Now, I think that the double side of education is important to realize here. Education can be the most effective way to prevent violence. It also can be the arena of humiliation that can stimulate violence. How can we apply this knowledge? I don't pretend to tell all of you how each of you can do this in your own school or your own life. I can describe that there are many different ways to do this. I know that in the schools in Shaker Heights, Ohio, which is a very affluent suburb of Cleveland, both the teachers and older students meet with incoming freshmen and second-year high school students to raise the question of bullying or teasing or exclusion and rejection. The students there are really quite, the students who've been in that school for a while are really amazingly mature and caring, I've discovered, given that they're working in a climate where the teachers and the administration are totally on their side. But what's effective is they have the older students serve as counselors and listening boards for the younger students, so that a freshman who's having trouble like this will meet with a senior who will try to help them to figure out what to do about the situation. But what they've reported to me is a remarkable degree of, we might say, collective intolerance for bullying, and a remarkable degree of, apparently, of avoiding it. Now, and being able to at least neutralize it when it begins to occur. They don't tolerate it, and they've figured out ways of solving the problem. And a lot of that is because I think they involve peers in the whole process. So it's not, a bunch of adults telling the teenagers what they should do. It's teenagers helping each other, and that's one approach that's helpful. I could mention one project I was deeply involved in, which started in a jail setting, but which we then expanded into a high school. This was all in San Francisco, where the sheriff, who was a very progressive guy, decided he wanted to replace retributive justice with restorative justice, meaning he wanted to get rid of this idea that jail was just to get revenge, retribution, on the prisoners by subjecting them to pain. He wanted to achieve a different result, which is to, you might say, educate the prisoners into wanting to restore to the community something of what they had taken from it, the sense of safety that they had deprived the community of through their violent crimes. So I worked for about 10 years with a group of men who, all of whom had been convicted and sent to prison or jail for a violent crime. And we found some approaches that really were remarkably successful in preventing violence. The one that I think was most useful was one we called Man Alive, which was a program in which we would deconstruct and reconstruct what we called the male role belief system. That is the idea that the set of rules that almost all men in our patriarchal society have been taught define what it is to be a man, how you define manhood, what men have a right to expect of women, how men are obligated to treat women, how women should behave toward men, and so on. And this was a kind of group therapy setting, but it was also, I would say, re-education. It wasn't therapy in the traditional sense of the word, although some people might call it sort of cognitive behavioral, but it was really re-education. And we would go through a second-by-second reconstruction in each of these group meetings, focusing on one of the men present at the meeting, reconstructing the crime that he had committed that had led to his being sent to jail. Why had he done it? What were the circumstances? And go through moment by moment. How did you feel when she said this? Or, how did that make you feel? What did you think you should do in response? What did you think she would do if, what would she think if you didn't do this? What would your friends think? And on and on and on and on for 2.5 hours. And by the end, these guys had realized just time after time that they, without even realizing the set of rules they were following, that they had internalized a set of assumptions about what it takes to be a real man. And one of the most important things is you've got to be the one who wears the pants in the family. But half these guys were in for domestic violence. They had beaten up their wives or girlfriends. And they would tell us how they had divided the world into the superior and the inferior. And in that polarization, men were supposed to be in the superior position and women were supposed to be in the inferior one. And any man who let a woman challenge that and start to become even equal, let alone superior, was a challenge to his sense of whether he was or was not an adequate male. Because if he wasn't an adequate male, then maybe like the school shooter I just described, he was really a faggot or a pussy or a nerd or something other than an adequate man. And so we called that moment a moment of fatal peril, which I felt was not an exaggeration, because as I've said, the men we worked with felt in danger of undergoing what I have come to call the death of the self through humiliation. When we worked with these men, I was amazed at how quickly they got the point. They really saw what they had been doing. They had not been aware they had these assumptions or that they were following these rules. But when the rules were kind of made explicit, they could realize how stupid they were. I mean, they were totally arbitrary, totally illogical. I mean, there was no basis for them. And they began to say things like that they had been brainwashed by the society they'd grown up in. And then they wanted to start teaching the new inmates who came into jail what they themselves had learned. And I remember one prisoner coming to a new guy who was coming in, who was all pumped up, full of adrenaline, ready to punch anybody who challenged him in any way. And one of the old-timers came up to him and said, "Hey, look, brother, I know how you're feeling. I felt that way. I've been that way myself, but in the past. But we don't treat each other that way here. You don't have to do that. And the guy wouldn't believe him at first, because jails and prisons are generally where people do treat each other that way. It's like a bunch of deer ready to clash antlers, but after 2 or 3 days, he generally would see that was right, and he would relax. Then they became amazingly supportive of each other. The whole issue of homophobia dropped away. Usually in prisons and jails, homophobia is so thick you could cut it with a knife. It's rather like a Republican Party convention, you might say. They began to realize that this was silly. It was dumb. There was no reason for it. And instead of being so homophobic, these guys became able to cry in front of each other. And one of the things that most surprised me that they cried about, they would cry because they had so alienated this woman they had beat up, which was the reason for their being in the jail, that the woman wouldn't have anything to do with them anymore. And the fact is, they really loved her. And they felt they had ruined their own lives by what they had done. And they began to realize that by letting themselves be brainwashed into this absurd view of masculinity, they had ruined their own lives, as well as really harming somebody else. What happened was that the level of violence within the jail dropped to zero for 12 months at a time. There were no incident reports for the kinds of things that routinely happen in ordinary jails. People beating each other up, stabbing each other, or stealing from each other, and so on, things that would be felonies in the community. And when they got out of the jail, their level of committing new violent crimes was 83% lower than that of an otherwise identical group of prisoners in an ordinary jail. I mean, an 83% reduction in violent reoffending. What it said to me, there's several things I thought we learned from this. One is that violence can be prevented, and I think that itself is one of the most important pieces of information that we can try to get out to the general public. And we're all educators here, and I think we really need to educate not just the prisoners and not just ourselves, but voters and politicians. And one of the things that is most important is that the usual attitude of hopelessness and pessimism and cynicism about violence simply isn't true. Violence is preventable. And in fact, every time the rate of violence goes down, and in the United States especially, I've tracked it since 1900 when we first started tallying the number of deaths from both forms of lethal violence, homicide and suicide. Violence goes up and it goes down, it goes up and it goes down. My thought is every time it goes down, that means we've prevented the amount of violence that otherwise would have occurred when it was up. So violence can be prevented, and we do it periodically. The problem is we then tend to forget what we were doing that worked and do something else that doesn't work if our goal is to prevent violence. But the usual public attitude, I think, is that there's nothing you can do with this population. It's like what I said earlier. I had been taught before I first went into the prisons. This population's untreatable, it's hopeless, intractable. All you can do is lock them up and throw away the key. That is totally untrue. Another lesson, I think, is that punishment is not the answer, although I do think that people who are harming others do need to be isolated from the community and restrained from harming others. I don't believe in throwing away the key and letting everybody out any more than I believe in locking them up and throwing away the key. Both of those are equally unworkable. When somebody's robbing and murdering, you got to protect the public. for at least as long a time as they are continuing to be dangerous. But above and beyond that, punishing them, that is the gratuitous infliction of further pain, that's totally unnecessary once you've made the community safe by putting them behind locked doors. A further pain, which we call punishment, only increases the amount of violence they commit or will commit in the future, not to mention the amount they commit in the jail or prison. So I believe in restraint. I believe in restraining people who are hurting other people. The same way I believe in restraining a 2-year-old who's running in front of traffic. If they don't respond to words and stop, you grab them, you put your arms around them, and you pull them back so they won't get hurt. But you don't hurt them yourself, because the whole point of doing this is so they won't get hurt. Unfortunately, we have forgotten to treat adults the way we take for granted we would treat children. But adults respond to the same psychology. The more punitive we are, the more violent a society we have. For example, the most extreme form of punishment is capital punishment. But we also know that the rate of homicide in the states that have capital punishment is at least 50% higher than it is in the states without capital punishment. We know that after capital punishment was reintroduced in the United States by the Supreme Court in 1976, what happened was, after that in the states that had the most capital punishment, the homicide rate went up very steeply. In the states that had the punishment on the books but didn't apply it, or else maybe just applied it once in a while, the rate of homicide still went up, but not nearly as steeply. In the states that did not reintroduce capital punishment, the rate of homicide just drifted down year after year. Now, that doesn't prove that capital punishment stimulates violence, but I certainly think that it's incompatible with any hypothesis that capital punishment does deter violence. And in general, I would say the U.S. has the most punitive criminal justice system in the developed world, much more than Canada's or Western Europe's or the other industrially developed democracies. And the U.S. has by far the highest rates of homicide and other violent, well, particularly homicide, which is the most accurately measured and most severe violent crime. But in most other violent crimes, we also tend to lead the pack. So I suppose if I'm going to try to sum up what I've been saying, I would try to suggest that we actually have learned a lot about violence over the years. A lot more people now are studying this than were when I first started working in this field, my gosh, 40-some years ago. I think we know a lot more now than we did then. And I think our task now is to try to not only continuing to educate ourselves about it, but also educate voters and educate politicians and other people in positions of influence and authority. Because I think we can do a much better job than we have been doing up to now, and sometimes we do a better job, but then we tend to undo it once we've seen it works. So I wanted to introduce these ideas. As I said, I think if you grasp the general principles I'm talking about, I think you can see for yourself how to apply them in your own particular context. But I would like to, I'd like to stop at that so that I can open our discussion up for everybody who is here to make any comments, add any observations of your own, ask any questions, and I hope have a rich discussion among the group of us. So I will ask any of you who wants to make a comment or ask a question? Yes.
Thank you. I missed your quote from Malcolm X. If you wouldn't mind repeating it.
I'm sorry, my quote from what?
Malcolm X.
Oh, Malcolm X.
And secondly, I worked 2 years in the prison system as the non-ordained minister there for religious activities. And there seemed to be two circles, those who felt the prisoners were there to be punished more, but there was also a circle of people who were there trying to rehabilitate, so there was a little bit of hope as well. But if I could have the quote again, please.
Sure. The quote from Malcolm X was this. He said, nobody can give somebody else self-respect or self-esteem. People can only gain that for themselves through their own achievements. But what we can do is determine whether or not they're going to have access to the resources they need in order to gain self-respect, such as education or a good job, things like that. With respect to what, as I recall, I think this is in the autobiography of Malcolm X, as I remember. And I'm clearly paraphrasing him. I'm not quoting him exactly verbatim, but that was the point he was making. And I thought it was, and of course, he had a good deal of experience in prisons, including the first prison I worked in Massachusetts, the Norfolk State Prison. So I knew well the environment he was describing in his autobiography, which, by the way, is one of my favorite books. But what, because it's a story of somebody's constant reinvention and growth. I mean, it's like human development just visible. It's just amazing. But the, about prison guards, I would say several things. I think working in prisons tends to attract the best and the worst. And that's true not just of prison guards, but also of psychiatrists and other, professionals. There were people that I hired whom I had to fire and say, don't darken the door of this prison again with your presence. One interesting experience I had was there was a graduate student at Harvard who was a student brother actually of mine and my wife's, who, a young woman from Australia, who became a prison guard in order to study them. And she wrote her PhD thesis on that subject of the prison officers and their world. But one of the observations I was most struck by was she said that when she would ask the prison guards what their attitude was toward the prisoners and the idea of rehabilitation, they were much more humane and progressive and rehabilitation oriented than they said their fellow officers were. But of course they were all saying that. So you realize their individual attitudes really were more humane, but they were afraid that everybody else was tougher than they were, and that I interpreted this. I mean, they felt they would be shamed by their fellow officers as being namby-pamby, pussy, weak hearts and so forth, if they didn't become tough and somewhat sadistic. So there's such a thing as a subculture of violence in the prison, which is carried in the officers' world. But if you actually talk with each individual officer, often they're more humane than they feel they are allowed to behave in the prison. So it's that subculture that you have to try to change. We saw that change a little bit in the San Francisco jail in a funny way when one of the officers was behaving in the traditional way and humiliating one of the inmates and just insulting him and so forth. But that inmate, instead of doing what most inmates would do in that situation, which is to go back to his room and make an artificial knife and stab the guy when his back was turned, instead of doing that, he just turned to another inmate and said, he just doesn't get it yet, does he? And it struck me, he had really internalized, what we were trying to teach them about you don't have to be violent in order to maintain your masculine adequacy.
Okay, I was interested in what you said about the terrorists who worked with Osama bin Laden, because it's true that he talked about humiliation as a group, but having seen videos of these people before they go on their flights or whatever they're doing, they're very clear that they're doing this for the glory of God and for the glory of their religion, which I think is quite different from what you attribute to the prisoners you worked with.
In interpersonal violence, but just individual violence, one-on-one. And terrorists are engaging in collective violence. They're part of a political movement, and the violence is done for political reasons. So there absolutely is that difference between them. On the other hand, what I think they have in common with each other is they're both dealing with humiliation, except that the criminals I saw in the prison were dealing with their own individual humiliation at the hands of other individuals, even maybe a group of them. The terrorists are dealing with the collective humiliation of their whole group, not them as individuals, but the group. Osama bin Laden talked about the Islamic Nation. I mentioned in my workshop this morning, Adolf Hitler was elected on the campaign promise to undo the shame of Versailles, the Versailles Peace Treaty, which he felt had shamed the German nation. In other words, all these, the political violent leaders are talking about the collective shaming of a nation or ethnic group or religion with which they identify. To speak for the terrorists that followed bin Laden, they're speaking of their work as a way to glorify God is really a way of saying this is their way to glorify the religion in which they hold their belief in their God. I mean, they're glorifying Islam as they understand it, just as Christian fundamentalists are, they will say they're doing Christ's will or God's will, and every world religion has its fundamentalists and terrorists. But I would say they are dealing with collective shaming. But let me read a few things about what's really going on here. There's a very smart and I think admirable psychiatrist in Palestine named Ayad Sarraj. He's the founder of the Palestinian Independent Commission for Citizens' Rights, who really is trying to bring a democratic ethos into Palestinian politics. His description of the psychopathological motives of the Palestinian suicide bombers is this. He says, what propels Palestinian men and now women to blow themselves up in Israeli restaurants and buses is a long history of humiliation and a desire for revenge that every Arab harbors. I mean, basically, he could be quoting bin Laden on that. Since the establishment of Israel in 1948 and the resultant uprooting of Palestinians, a deep-seated feeling of shame has taken root in the Arab psyche. Shame is the most painful emotion in the Arab culture, producing the feeling that one is unworthy to live. The honorable Arab is the one who refuses to suffer shame and dies in dignity. In other words, like my prisoners who would overcome their shame by killing as many other people as possible, even though they died. But they'd feel they died in glory rather than shame. Other people have said the same thing. Tom Friedman, the New York Times' op-ed columnist, quoted a speech by the departing Prime Minister of Malaysia to a conclave of Muslim leaders. This was a man named Mahathir Mohamad. So his last name is Muhammad. It says 5 times he referred to Muslims as humiliated. And Friedman said, if I've learned one thing covering world affairs, it's this. The single most underappreciated force in international relations is humiliation. I will not enumerate the instances of our humiliation, Mr. Muhammad said. We are all Muslims. We are all being humiliated. Today, we, the whole Muslim community, are treated with contempt and dishonor. The Muslim countries and their people feel that they can do nothing right. Our only reaction is to become more and more angry. Angry people cannot think properly. Now, both of these Muslim commentators, they're not actually in any way defending this behavior. They're saying it's crazy. it's self-defeating, it's destructive, it's pathological. But Tom Friedman interprets this by saying the Arab-Israeli conflict is about the humiliation that comes from one side succeeding at modernity and the other not. As Mr. Muhammad says in his speech, we sacrifice lives unnecessarily, achieving nothing more than to attract more massive retaliation and humiliation. So again, he's not defending this. He's trying to diagnose it. Friedman concluded with a coda that my own work with violent criminals in this country only confirms. He said, never ever underestimate a people's pride, no matter how broken they might be. Tap into people's dignity, and they will do anything for you. Ignore it, and they won't lift a finger. Which is why a Pakistani friend tells me that what the U.S. needs most in Iraq is a strategy of, quote, dehumiliation and re-dignification, which, of course, is the opposite of what we have been doing in Iraq. So I'm saying I think that there's humiliation there, but it's seen as collective humiliation of the entire group rather than just aimed at one individual. And I think the glorification they achieve, sure, they say it's glorifying God, but it's really glorifying in that case, the Islamic religion and the Islamic nation.
We know that in our society, our young men are more likely to fail in school, not to finish even their high school. They're more likely to engage into group violence, and they're more likely to substance abuse, okay? Yet they were taught that the traditional role model was to protect, to provide, and to reproduce. Well, we know what happened with all those three things, you know. We don't need to engage into the act to reproduce, and they don't need to protect women anymore, and they certainly don't need to provide for them. I don't know what kind of thoughts you can give us in terms of using this model of the reconstructing the man belief system to try to change this culture of traditional roles and to more like a new role that is more adapted to to our society, so they don't get into violence, they succeed, and they can still be part of the reproducing our society in a positive way.
Okay, thank you. Well, let me start by saying that I know I've been talking so far a lot about, I think, trying to understand individual motives for violence and to provide the kind of knowledge that a psychologist or psychotherapist or social worker or whoever, any mental health professional might want to be thinking about when they're working with an individual who has committed serious violence or is vulnerable to doing so. But I'd like to shift gears now and talk about the question of epidemics of violence and the epidemiology of violence, because I think that's what an issue you've raised. This is affecting a whole generation of young men, not just one individual at a time, but a whole group of them. And there, I think we really do need to kind of put on a different thinking cap and think in terms of kind of sociological and political concepts. The causes of violence are multiple. Violence is a multi-determined variety of different actions. There are many forms of violence, and there are many different causes of it. But the causes, I would say, do tend to be interrelated. They reinforce each other. One of the, I can put it this way. In medical school, I was taught that all diseases are biopsychosocial in nature. That is, there are biological, psychological, and social causes of every disease. even cancer or tuberculosis or whatever. It certainly is true of violence. I've talked today mostly about the psychological causes of violence. I'm not even going to get into the biological ones because they're not relevant right now, and also they're less powerful than the social and psychological ones as causes of violence. But I want to now talk about some of the sociological causes, or social, socioeconomic, and political. And let me say here, I want to talk about something I learned from the United States, but I think it will, you can apply it, in Canada. In the United States, we went through an epidemic of violence during the time that conservative Republican presidents were in power, from roughly 1970 until one of our Democratic presidents, Bill Clinton, was able to undo the damage they had done, which took him really into his second term in office. It takes a time to undo that amount of damage. What happened was from 1970 to 1977, the U.S. underwent an epidemic of violence, meaning increases both in suicide and homicide, both forms of lethal violence, which by the time the most conservative Republican up to that point, Ronald Reagan, became president, the rate of unemployment among the youth, the rate of poverty among the youth, the rate of inequality in our society, the rate of relative poverty, all increased, particularly for youth, for teenagers and adolescents. And the epidemic of violence that we suffered from, in fact, became an epidemic of youth violence. People, particularly, the highest increases were in the teenage range, the 14 or 15 to 19, and then the young adult range from 19 to 24. The rates of both suicide and homicide increased 5- and 6-fold from the mid-1950s to the mid-1990s. I mean, a staggering increase in both. There are several causes for that. The unemployment rate skyrocketed among the young. The rate of the youth who were in poverty increased, who were living below the poverty line. The gap in income and wealth between affluent and poor youth declined. In America during that time, the highest degree of poverty in any age group was children. It wasn't the middle-aged or the elderly. It used to be the elderly, but the elderly can vote, so that under both Democrats and Republicans, I've written about this and I've put up charts and graphs, but I'll describe it. If you look at the amount of money that the U.S. government has been spending on the elderly for, say, the last half century, the line is just straight up. More and more and more is going to support the elderly. Thank God. I mean, it has been very helpful. It has meant that the elderly, instead of being poor, have had the lowest rate of poverty in the U.S. But if you look at the amount spent on children, the line is absolutely flat. It's just there's been no additional help, and in fact, the rate of poverty has been going up. If you put all these things together, I can add a few more things. In the U.S., particularly, African American males are incarcerated in prisons and jails at a rate on the range of 7 to 10 times per capita as whites are. Most of these incarcerations are for violations of the drug laws, even though it is clear from one study after another that African Americans don't use the illegal drugs any more often than whites do. But whites are put in substance abuse treatment programs, blacks are put in jails and prisons. America has started an unprecedented social engineering experiment, which I would call mass incarceration. since the mid-1970s, when the Republicans under Nixon and Ford were in power. And our imprisonment rate has increased sevenfold since the mid-1970s. I mean, on a per capita basis. Whereas for the first 3 quarters of the 20th century, it was flat, no increase or decrease to speak of. The only way to, I think, make sense of the increase in the imprisonment rate is that it has been a new way of reinstituting white supremacy after the success of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, when Lyndon Johnson got incredibly powerful laws against discrimination against the African American community. So, and more when blacks are put in prison, then they're deprived of the right to vote. So we found a new way to disenfranchise the black community. Now, I put all of this together and I say, I can see there's a population here of young men who are in prison so they can't be responsible husbands and fathers at home. But when they're out of prison, they're unemployed and poor, so they can't possibly support a family. All of these, I've mentioned several different factors. I could mention 10 more. What I'm saying, these factors all interact, they interrelate with each other. I've charted the Republican and Democratic administrations since 1900. Without a single exception, when the Conservative Party, the Republicans, have been in office, both the rate and the duration of unemployment have gone up. Without a single exception, every time there's been a Democratic administration, the rate and duration of unemployment have gone down. Unemployment itself determines how much there's relative poverty in the society. These are all interrelated factors. So what I'm saying is, if you behave toward youth in such a way that you keep them poor, unemployed, imprisoned, and on and on and on, it's not surprising to me that they become demoralized. Of course, they're not going to want to think of themselves as supporting a family or protecting people or anything. They've been rejected by society. So I would say, if I'm going to try to answer your question, you can fill in the details in Canada much more than I can. I'm just describing what I've learned in the United States. But, if our goal in the U.S. had been to raise the levels of lethal violence to the highest possible degree, we could hardly have done better. I mean, we could hardly have chosen a more effective set of policies. When I say we, I'm talking primarily about the conservative politicians. When Democrats have gotten in power, the rates of lethal violence have actually gone down throughout the 20th century. When Republicans have been in power, they've gone up. Well, anyway, all that is in my latest book that has the semi-humorous title, Why Some Politicians Are More Dangerous Than Others. And my point is that the Republican politicians are more dangerous than the Democratic, not because they're necessarily evil or they even know what they're doing, but because they are pursuing policies that kill people. And it's that simple.
Thank you, Dr. Gilligan.